On today's episode of Boundary Breakers, we sit down with Walt Rakowich. Walt is a former CEO of Prologis, a publicly traded commercial real estate firm. He was brought in as CEO when the company was struggling and on the brink of bankruptcy, and took that company from almost bankrupt to one of the best performing companies in the S&P 500. And how did he do it? He did it by practicing authentic leadership, by exercising and demonstrating humility, honesty, and transparency with his team. You guys are going to love this episode. Boundary Breakers is brought to you by Carter & Clark. So that's fantastic, Walt. Well, thank you so much. If you could you give us just a little bit of background in terms of I like to call it your origin story, right? For the audience, just where you grew up, where you came from, just so we could understand, a little bit of your background.
Sure, you bet, Brandon. First of all, thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure to be on, and hopefully I've got some good things for your listeners to tune into. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Please, if you're not a Steeler fan, please don't hold that against me.
Try.
Even though I am. I grew up in Pittsburgh, very humble family background, very much a middle-class family. And my father was, both my father and my mother were children of European immigrants who had come over and really didn't come over much more or much longer before they were born. So, and I ultimately went to Penn State University and became an accounting major. Came home after that and lived in Pittsburgh for a couple of years. Worked for Price Waterhouse, and became a CPA. And one day I sort of woke up and I thought to myself, I've learned a lot here, but I'm not sure I want to have the green eye shades on forever. And so I began to apply to business schools and was very fortunate to get into Harvard Business School, got an MBA there, moved to Boston for the 2 years while I got the MBA. And then ultimately, one of the nice things about going to business school was that I had 2 years to think about what I really wanted to do in life. And what I realized was that I was attracted to an industry where I could actually see what I was doing, what I was creating. In fact, I've told people before I would be a horrible software developer because I can't see it.
Gotcha.
I mean, maybe I could see the results, but I can't see it. And but real estate was very attractive to me because I could, buy a piece of land, survey it. Buy a piece of land and you work with an architect and a contractor to design it and build it and watch it go up. And I had to lease it, but ultimately maybe I sold it, maybe I held on to it, but I had to finance it. And some of that, my financial background kicked in there. And I just loved it because it was a business that I could touch and feel.
Yeah.
And that's why I ended up going into real estate, work for Trammell Crow Company in the commercial space, moved out to LA. And I said to the partner when I first got out there, I said, what am I going to do? And he said, well, Walt, in Los Angeles, we only really do one thing. Well, I shouldn't say that. We build some office buildings, but what we really do is warehouses. And I looked at him and I said, warehouses? And what I didn't realize is that 40% of all shipments come into and out of the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. Most people into the United States and out of the United States come through those two ports. That's how critical those ports are. And of course, what happens is the infrastructure around those ports is warehouses. And so that's what Trammell Crow's business predominantly was in Southern California, was building warehouses. And I became a warehouse expert, if you will. And
wow.
So basically, I worked for Crow for 10 years. And the early 90s, we had a really bad recession. 90% of the people in the real estate business ended up trading business cards in the 90s because a lot of their former employers went bankrupt, or banks were taking back properties in the RTC. Remember those days, Brandon?
Oh yeah.
So I went to work for what was a startup company, and that startup company was called Security Capital Industrial Trust, which ultimately changed its name to a name you would know, or maybe some of your listeners would know, Prologis.
Prologis.
And,
Gotcha.
and I ultimately worked my way up in the company. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that too. But that's some of my background. Moved the family all over the place, from Pittsburgh to ultimately to Boston when I went to school, to Los Angeles, to Columbus, to Chicago, and then I've been in Denver, Colorado here for the last 23, 24 years. That's where the company was headquartered when I worked at the company.
Gotcha. No, that's fantastic. And that was perfect. I appreciate the background. I took a couple of notes. I want to let you know, it's a big Atlanta Falcons fan here.
Oh, good. There you go.
I want to let you know that you've got a very, very good offensive coordinator. So Arthur Smith.
Oh, yeah. My understanding is he went to the Steelers, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's what I heard.
Is a family friend of ours, and so that's just a great family, and the guy is a football genius. In fact, his father started FedEx.
Oh, wow!
So Fred Smith, yeah. I mean, the guy is super sharp.
Yeah.
And I think he'll do big things for you guys. So I'm an adopted Steelers fan now, I got to tell you.
Well, I will say this: after living in Denver for the last 24 or so years, I've also become a Bronco fan, and my kids are big Bronco fans. So I have to tread lightly.
I understand. There's a lot of politics involved in fandom. I understand.
That's right.
Yeah, same way for me. But no, it's interesting with the Trammell Crow background, because there was a lot of folks that came from Trammell Crow that went on in the Atlanta market to make significant impacts in commercial real estate, particularly with multifamily. The Post properties and then Gables Residential were all Trammell Crow alums.
Yep.
In our neck of the woods. So, it seems like that was a great breeding ground for the next generation of real estate leaders.
Yeah, Ron Terwilliger ran that company. I don't know if he was in Atlanta or not, but Ron Blankenship, there was a number of people in that company that made an amazing impact, for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's really interesting. Well, I'm curious, I want to jump into sort of your journey at your first stint at Prologis. But I'm curious, just real quick before we move on, just briefly, did you, looking back, reflecting on your time at Harvard Business School, and what you learned and what it prepared you for, there's just so many divergent opinions about higher education these days. I'm curious how you look back on that and the sort of the value of the MBA education at Harvard.
Well, for me, it was just an absolute amazing experience. Way back at that point in time, John McEnroe was a great tennis player, and somebody asked me, I remember, and I still remember today, tell me about why'd you go to HBS? And I said, it's kind of like playing tennis. I mean, if I was playing every day with my best friend, I would reach a certain plateau. But I guarantee if I was playing with John McEnroe every day, I would be a much better tennis player. I'd never be a pro, but I'd be a much better tennis player. And ultimately, what Harvard Business School did for me was a couple things. One, it increased my confidence in I think myself, but also my abilities, because in many respects, I was kind of alongside of some of the smartest people I ever met in my life, and they pushed me, they challenged me, and I think the same goes for leadership. There's a lot of leaders that really want to be the smartest people in the room. But ultimately, the best leaders are the ones that surround themselves with people that are better than them, because it makes them better. And ultimately, that's really what I wanted to accomplish by going to HBS. I knew I wouldn't be the smartest person in the room. I was just hoping I wouldn't be the last in terms of intelligence. But I was I would say I was probably someplace into the middle to the lower end. But anyway, I learned a tremendous amount, and I watched future captains of industry, perform right before me, and ultimately learned a lot about how I should be as well. And so it made me better at the things that I did.
That is a really, really insightful answer, because I think most people think about graduate school and they think about what's the what are they going to walk away from in terms of what they learned, right? Like it's like specific material from the professor.
Yeah.
And that's a very short-sighted way of looking at it, right? And I think I'm glad that you shared that, because that does ring true for me. If you're able, look, iron sharpens iron. If you're able to be around the best in the world in an environment like that, then certainly you're going to come out the other end much better for it.
I think that's
really interesting.
I won't tell you that I didn't learn a lot about business. I did.
Sure.
I never knew what an IRR was, but net present value was prior to that. But so there was a lot of different tools that I learned. But yes, you're absolutely right. The most important thing I learned was how to be better and also have more confidence of how I could interact with, that level of intelligence. I think that really helped me a lot.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's interesting. That's really interesting. All right. So you joined Prologis. So what year was that?
Oh gosh, that would have been
around
1994.
Okay.
And the
94
company had just gone public whenever I joined the company. So it was a very small company, went public, and I started there in my career. I started. I moved my family from Los Angeles to the Midwest, to Columbus, Ohio. And my job was to build the company's mid-Atlantic region. The company was so small that it had no operations east of the Mississippi. And so, I moved there and started all of the cities, New York and Washington and, Chicago, and started them from scratch. And it was a tremendously fun job. And I could apply the very things that I did at Trammell Crow there. But then a funny thing happened, Brandon. The CEO flew to Chicago, where at that point in time I was living, and he said, "Well, we're going to go international. We're going to go to Europe and Asia and South America, and we really need a person to come to Denver, Colorado, and be the CFO that that understands and has built real estate in the past and can speak to the complexities associated with moving to those markets, but also convince people that it's a wise decision for us to go international. And I really need somebody that can talk the talk. And so I'm going to ask you to go from being an operating person to a chief financial officer. Are you willing to do that?" And I told him no. And ultimately, my wife, he called my wife up and he said, "This is not a smart decision on Walt's part. And so you really need to get Walt to do this." And so my wife convinced me ultimately to move to Denver, Colorado, and become the chief financial officer of Prologis.
Holy cow! Well, that's a fascinating story. Wait, so tell us why did you say no? Why did you say no at first?
You know what? I said no because I loved real estate so much, and my fear was that at being the chief financial officer was going to take me back to my accounting roots, and I'm going to become that glorified accountant again. And what I really didn't realize is, number one, it was a stepping stone to become the CEO of the company. And number two, I would be financing billions of dollars of transactions all throughout the world, utilizing banks, investment banks, and private equity, raising public equity, all throughout the world. And it would be truly one of the most exciting things that I ever did in my career, and pushed me to do something that, frankly, I didn't know anything about. And so he took this glorified accountant that knew a little bit about real estate and ultimately made me a CFO.
Well, that's interesting. And gosh, what a tactic, huh? So you said no, so he called your better half.
Yeah.
To talk some sense into you.
I know. And
that's fantastic.
The other lesson, Brandon, is listen to people. I mean, don't always think you're right. And I had so much respect for my wife, but my wife, sat me down and talked to me about some things that night that really, really helped me in my decision. And I respect her so much. And ultimately it became a joint decision, a decision she really wanted to make, but that she really convinced me that it was the right thing to do.
Wow. That's great.
Yeah.
Look, there are very few, if any, highly successful individuals out there that don't have an extraordinarily supportive, better half, right?
Absolutely. Could agree with you more.
Yeah. So I'm right there with you. I also hit the spouse lottery and have one of those myself that I'm very thankful for. So, gosh, that's fantastic. That big blessing. All right. So you moved to Denver.
Yep.
And so how long had you been at Prologis on the operating side before you became CFO? Roughly.
Okay. So my journey was 5 years in the operating side, 6 years as a chief financial officer.
Okay.
And then I was promoted to president and chief operating officer. And I was in that position for about 4 years.
Okay.
And I reported to a CEO that was also relatively new in the job. I mean, it's interesting. The first 15 years of the company that I just articulated, the company was truly a darling on Wall Street, an absolute darling on Wall Street. And we had a sound strategy. We had great people. We had a terrific brand, and we were a market leader in our industry. And Prologis still is a market leader, but there is a time where Prologis almost went bankrupt. And so as the story goes, I was promoted to president, chief operating officer.
Okay.
And I was in that position for a couple of years, and I could see that the CEO and I didn't really see eye to eye in a lot of different areas. And in most cases, Brandon, people don't leave companies; they leave leaders. They leave their boss is what they do, and bosses don't always understand that. And I as the president of the company, the CEO was my boss, and I loved the company, but I couldn't reconcile what good leadership meant to how he felt good leadership would be. And on one hand, let me tell you, I had great respect for him. He was also a Harvard Business School guy. I had a lot of respect for him. I mean, he was probably one of the most brilliant people that I ever met in my life. On the other hand, I really felt marginalized by his ability to look brilliant. And, I didn't feel listened to. I didn't feel trusted. I didn't feel like he had my back. And frankly, I didn't feel like I could trust him. And we got to a point where I could really see the culture changing in the company, again, as the number 2 person, but the chief financial officer replaced me, other people below. We began to act in silos, and we didn't communicate as a team and talk in the open, made poor investment decisions, and ultimately over-leveraged the company. And when the Great Recession hit in 2008, at that point in time, I had been a president of the company for about 4 years, and I just couldn't handle it anymore. There was a number of things that I write about in my book, and I ultimately resigned in January 2008. I told the board that I couldn't work there anymore, and we all know what happened in 2008. The market was down 38% to 40% or so, something like that, and but our mistakes were manifested in a much greater way. And by November, I had been gone for 10 months from the company. By November of 2008, our stock was down 95%, and we were the third worst performing stock in the S&P 500. And I tell the story because it ultimately became the reason why I came back. And what happened was the Wall Street Journal did a front page article on Prologis and how we were probably the next bankruptcy in the real estate space. And on November 8th that year, 2008, I got a call from the board, and the board said, look, we're going to let go of the CEO, and we want you to come back and run the company. Will you do it? And man, I mean, this is another time I actually had to sit down with my wife, and she convinced me to do it. I mean, I knew it was going to take a Herculean effort. And if that company goes bankrupt, it's 2 or 3 years of your life. And, but on the other hand, I had hired a lot of the people that were there, and I knew the people, and it was my crucible moment. And for whatever reason, I decided to go back and ultimately run the company. And I'll tell you what, over the next 4 years, I learned what leadership was all about in that crucible moment. And I was never so aware of how my actions would be reflected throughout our employee base until you take over a company that is on the verge of bankruptcy. And so ultimately, I learned a lot about leadership. And looking back on it, it was a tremendous time in my life, even though I was going crazy. And like I said, I learned a lot of leadership lessons as a result of that. So I became the
That's
CEO, and just to kind of wrap that up, I was the CEO of Prologis for about I don't know, between 4 and 5 years, and then ultimately retired. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that happened in the meantime.
absolutely. No, I love that. And I want to unpack some of that a little bit because, you tell the story so gracefully. And there's just so much. So I've got so many thoughts going through my mind. First of all, I can't imagine the decision process you had to go through. In the middle of the greatest financial crisis of our lifetime. You're asked to come and take the helm of a publicly traded real estate company, right? That's like asking to come take over as captain of the ship in the world's most dangerous hurricane, and hopefully, with all these people on it, you can navigate the ship appropriately. So, I could completely see how that would be a nerve-wracking decision. But I want to give you an opportunity and to dig a little bit deeper into some of the things that you mentioned about leadership. So when you were president and CEO, when you were president and COO, and you had a relatively new boss, the relatively new CEO.
Yeah,
you mentioned a lot of the problems that you guys had, right? You started working in silos and things. How easy was it, or could you at the time sort of juxtapose that existing CEO's conduct and leadership and actions versus the prior CEO's conduct and leadership and actions? And were there things is this sort of like a death by 1,000 cuts scenario, or is this something that is just blatantly obvious that anybody can see?
I thought it was blatantly obvious. I think it was a little bit more blatantly obvious to the people that had to work for him as opposed to the people from the outside, the outside. In particular, our board didn't see it as much as we did, but we were there day in and day out. And to your question, how I would compare and contrast it, and this relates to a lot of what I've written about in my book, is I think leadership is I think there's certain leaders that want to be the smartest person in the room, kind of what I said a little, not too long ago.
Yep.
And ultimately want to look brilliant. There's other leaders that, humbly speaking, either don't believe that they're the smartest person in the room or don't have to believe that they're the smartest person in the room. And they empower people. They give people credit. They lift them up. They're good listeners. And they respond to what people are saying. And actually, most importantly, they trust the people that work for them. If you don't have the right people in the room, then yes, you let them go. But ultimately, you build your team with the right people, and then you trust them. And and when you do that, you build trust in return. And what happens when you have someone in the position that needs to look brilliant is credit isn't given. And I write a lot in my book about the worst thing that leaders can have, or two things: pride and fear. They can be very prideful, and they can think that they're the greatest thing since sliced bread, and that leads to arrogance, and that leads to poor decision making in so many different things. And in our case, as lieutenants, we were telling the CEO, "Don't do this," and he was doing it because his gut said that was the right thing to do. We were actually closer to the market, I think. And then the second thing is fear, and fear leads to insecurities, and insecurities causes certain leaders to do certain things as well. And I'm not sure that he was as fearful as much as he was prideful. But anyway,
Gotcha.
That's what was happening at the top. And when you're that kind of leader, you don't listen to people. You don't give people credit. You don't empower them. You become a little bit more dictatorial and command and control, sort of operator. And that's really what was happening. And so everybody below him feels demoralized and doesn't feel like their contribution matters.
Gotcha.
And that's how you destroy a business. That's how you destroy people in the business ultimately. And that's why people don't want to stick around.
Yeah. No, and that's really interesting. And you answered the question that I was about to ask with that particular answer. And what I was going to ask was, look, for people that haven't worked in a publicly traded entity, or people that maybe have worked in smaller businesses, they may want to know, well, look, I mean, even if the CEO isn't a great leader, or even if the CEO, has a big ego or pride or what have you, how can that lead to the destruction of a business, right? And I think, if you get into a toxic environment, if you've ever been in one, as I have as well, it's obvious because you see sort of how that cancer kind of spreads.
Yep.
But you also, I think you mentioned something that is really, really insightful, right? You said that you have these, whether it's pride or whether it's fear, you have these scenarios, emotions that lead to certain things, but ultimately lead to poor decision making.
Yes.
And that you guys were actually saying, don't do this, but that's how a poor leader can get a business financially into trouble. A publicly traded company, is they start making these poor decisions.
That's exactly
is that fair?
So I'm going to give you a quick example of something that hit me. I read about 3 years ago or so, I read an HBR article. It says what CEOs are afraid of. Okay. And they interviewed like 120 or 130 CEOs all from throughout the world. Actually, a lot of them were in Europe, but Asia and the United States as well. And they asked them, what's your biggest fear? Now, you would have thought that these CEOs would have said competition, or, their people leaving, or maybe their financial well-being, maybe where their stock price is, right? But something external, right?
Right.
You know what the number one fear is of CEOs? Incompetence. Okay. The CEOs talked about, believe it or not, incompetence, a fear of being wrong, the imposter syndrome. I was promoted to this job and I might be wrong at what I'm doing. Okay. And so CEOs would say, okay, they said, well, how would that manifest itself in bad decision making? And admittedly, some of them said, I've become a little bit more of a dictator. I don't listen to people as much because I need to feel like I'm right.
Interesting.
The second one was underachievement. Okay. It caused, and so it's a fear of not doing enough, the fear of the competition. Okay. If we don't do this, the competitors are going to do it. And it caused them to take bad risks. It led to a lack of discipline. And that's why I say, and so anyway, my point is that, it wasn't about something external. It was something much more internal, right? It was about themselves.
Wow.
And I think that's the issue. Don't get me wrong. You have to think about what is a competition doing and am I making the right decision? But I feel like the way you make the right decision is you lean on as many people as you can, ask them their advice, surround yourself with great people. Don't always think that you're right. And I think when you believe that, when you don't fear the fact that you might have smarter people in the room, but you let them, kind of work the way they want to work.
Right.
I mean, that's how you make good decisions. And I think that's lost on too many leaders. When they're promoted into the job, they feel like they got to have all the answers.
Right.
And they don't.
That is really interesting. And you just connected something for me that I have been thinking about for months in doing this podcast. You mentioned imposter syndrome, and I've been fascinated. So like we talked about, the premise of this podcast is talking to highly successful people that have made it to the top of the mountain of their chosen profession. And I've been stunned at the number of people that I've interviewed that they either, brought it up by name, right? Like that I suffered at that point from a little bit of imposter syndrome, or it was clear to me that they felt like, gosh, what am I doing here? How did I get here? I don't deserve this. I'm not as good. I'm not, maybe somebody else might deserve this more. But what you just really connected for me is it sounds to me like that's a common thought from leaders, or common potential way of thinking by leaders, but that some people choose to respond to that in one way, right? Which is, oh, I've got to be right. I've got to prove to all these people I know what's going on. I got to prove to them I'm the smartest person in the room. Others, like yourself, respond in a much less egotistical way, frankly, to say, gosh, if I'm not the smartest person in the room, maybe I need some others to help. Maybe it'd be a great thing to have somebody that's smarter than me so that we can guide this company in the right direction. And if you don't care who gets the credit and you're not worried about the way that you look, then it seems to me like that, even if you do have a little bit of imposter syndrome, responding in that way ends up manifesting much more positive, or it would tend to lead to the potential for more success for the business versus the selfish way of responding, saying, oh, I've got to do this and I've got to look smart, I've got to look perfect.
That's right. Let me tell you, Brandon, can I tell you a quick story?
Please. That's what we're here for. I love it.
I'm going to tell you a quick story that I'm not going to say that I'm proud of, but it was a story that ultimately exposed me, and I think really strengthened the bonds of the people internally and empowered them to solve a certain problem. So when I went back to the company, within 2 months, I went back in early November, and by Christmas, we truly were on the verge of bankruptcy. I didn't know that. And I knew that sort of intellectually, but no one had told me that until I walked into a room in a financial meeting that a bunch of our finance people and I had, and it was after midnight. And so it was really, really late. We were working dog years. And one of my financial managers said, Walt, I've got some bad news for you. I said, what's that? He said, well, I think we're going to blow our bond covenants in the first quarter of next year. And we had, I don't know, we had over $10 billion in bonds outstanding. And I can't remember how much we're cross-collateralized, how much we were going to blow, but it was billions of dollars of bond because our earnings weren't strong enough. And I said, well, what does that mean? And my chief financial officer said, well, Walt, I think may have to declare bankruptcy. And I got white as a ghost, Brandon. And I looked around the room and I really felt like I was going to faint. And I said, guys, do you mind if I just leave the room for a couple minutes and just catch my breath? And they said, no, that's fine, Walt, no problem. So I walked down the hallway and I felt myself fainting. And there in front of me was a desk and a chair in one of the offices. And I tried to get to the chair and I didn't make it. And on the way down and fainting, my head hit the corner of the desk and I started bleeding and completely knocked me out. And I was laying on the floor for what turned out to be about 10 minutes. Okay.
Oh my God.
And then when I woke up, I looked around and I didn't know where I was for maybe another 30 seconds. And then all of a sudden I see the blood on the floor and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's about 10 people waiting for me to come back in this room. And this is horrible. So yeah. I go to the bathroom and I made sure that I stopped the bleeding in the bathroom. And I walked into the room and I said, okay, guys, let's talk about what we were going to talk about when I left. And the CFO looked at me and my CFO said, no, Walt, let's talk about that god-awful lump on your head. And I looked around the room and I said, you know what, guys? I'm busted. I said, you know what? I took this job 2 months ago because I felt like the board wanted me to come back and lead the recovery of this company. And I said, I just want you to know, I got no answers. I have no idea what to do. I've never been in this position before, ever. And I don't ever want to be in this position again. But I do know one thing. I'm not going to be the person that solves this problem. You guys are. What do we do next? And I looked around, and it was the most vulnerable moment that I could ever put myself in. And I had nowhere to go. And I think vulnerability is the most uncomfortable thing for leaders. And yet, I'd say used judiciously can be very powerful because it's human. And it's hate to say this, but it's the ultimate expression of honesty because nobody wants to be in that position. And I found out that by letting my guard down, I invited others to do that. And that's where real communication starts. If you want to communicate with your lieutenants, and being vulnerable every once in a while is okay. And you know what the interesting thing was? My people went back and they came up with a brilliant answer. It took several months to implement it, but we did implement it. We sold our entire China operation. We sold half of our Japan operation, used the proceeds to pay down debt and renegotiate our credit covenants. And I mean, it because we had, some currency to deal with, and ultimately saved ourselves from having to, declare bankruptcy. And it was not a solution that I had in my back pocket. It was a solution that was brought to me, and a solution that ultimately I embraced. And I just think that too many leaders, like I said, aren't willing to be vulnerable, aren't have to have all the answers and the like. The fact of the matter is that your lieutenants, 9 times out of 10, have better information and greater information, more in-depth information than you ever will. And, you're a team, and you got to rely on them. And when you do, you empower them and you build trust. And when you build trust, you could be a better leader.
Gosh, that's one of, if not the most powerful leadership story that I've heard from a CEO, Walt. And in listening to it, it made me want to try to find a solution, right? To come up with, it put me in that room, and I can understand why every single person in that room would want to go dig deep and try to find something that would potentially contribute, right?
Yep.
Unbelievable. So I was talking with somebody recently who said something that I thought was really powerful as well. Who told me that in leadership and business, the 3 most powerful words that a leader can say to a lieutenant are, "What's your recommendation?"
Love it. Absolutely.
And,
if you don't use it, and I think that's what people get concerned about, is they ask them and then they do something different. And I think that's just a question of transparency and communication. I mean, you go back and you say, I think what you said had a lot of merit, but I also listened to these 3 other people, and it is my job to amalgamate all that and make the decision. And I decided to go this way for X, Y, and Z reasons.
Yeah.
Too often people don't just, their problem isn't the decisions they make. It's just that they don't know how to communicate it.
Yeah.
And ultimately,
Amen.
They don't build trust because they don't communicate it, or they don't communicate it well, and people don't want to give them their opinions in the future.
Right.
And you can't shoot people for giving their opinions either,
Right.
So,
right. But, the reason, to me, the reason your story is so powerful, right, is because we just talked about the prior CEO that you worked for, right, who you couldn't, that people couldn't trust, that you didn't know if they were going to take something, or if they were going to, if you might get potentially stabbed in the back. And so if you think about the same scenario if that prior leader was in that chair, right, those people, those lieutenants in that scenario would look at that person and say, yeah, well, this is going to look really bad on you, right? Like, I'm not fighting for you, right? You won't fight for me when it's my turn. Why you expect me to go dig deep and come up with something for you? But in your scenario, right, the board realized that maybe they realized they had made a mistake and they needed an authentic, genuine leader, and they brought you in. In your scenario, you showed the vulnerability, the transparency, and the authenticity. And everybody in that room is my guess. Obviously, I wasn't there. My guess is everyone in that room thought to themselves, all right, damn it, we're going to figure this out. We're going to figure this out for Walt.
We got to get a solution here. Yeah.
Yeah. No, because they loved you. They wanted that you were real. You were a person that they you were part. They felt like they were a part of your team. You cared about them, and that they wanted to help you.
Yeah.
And that
I think
that is so cool. That is so cool. That's exactly why I do this podcast. Is with the hope that a guest like you will share a story like that. Because so many people talk about leadership and they talk in these platitudes and they say, well, what do you do when nobody's looking? Or, all these cliches, right? And there's not enough real world stories like you just shared that really bring the point home. And so thank you for that. Thank you.
You bet.
So much.
I'm delighted to say it. And there's a lot more stories too. My book is Transfluence. Transfluence, it stands for transformational influence. And the premise behind the book is, look, when you're a leader, it's not about you. What it is about is the transformational influence, the transformational impact that you can make on those around you. I think too often we are consumed as leaders with the ultimate goal of, you name it, increasing earnings or, becoming a stronger company. And, it's the financial things that are on the paper that the board gives us and says, this is what your goals are. The fact of the matter is, the more important thing is the journey. It's not the destination. Yeah, the destination's important, but you don't forget about the journey. And the journey is the impact that you have on everybody around you. And that's what leadership is all about. And so Transfluence, the book, talks about, how can you be an amazing influence on the people around you? And how do you build trust in your organization as a leader? And, it's not about, hitting your financial metrics and everybody high-fiving each other at the end of the day that they won. Nah, it's really about how we treated each other in the journey that counts.
That's really cool. You know what that reminded me of? We were talking football earlier. It reminds me of a lot of that Nick Saban at Alabama, right? Some people say he's one of, if not the best college football coach in history. They did 60-minute specials. They asked him, what is it? What do you do? What is it that you have? What's your magic touch? And he often references that, look, you can't sit here and focus on, we're going to go win this game. We're going to go win a national title. We're going to go win the conference. If you focus on those goals, those are just the results that come from the thing that you should be focused on.
Exactly.
And that you can't necessarily control the results, but you can control if you have a good journey, if you focus on the right things as a leader. And it sounds like, I just started it, but that Transfluence is it's the business approach. It's the parallel to in business that Nick Saban took in college football, at least similar from that perspective.
Yep.
Which is exciting.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think if you go to work every day with that mindset, what can I do for other people? And not be focused so much on yourself. I really think you'll build a tremendous amount of trust. And actually, I think in many respects, Brandon, it boils down to doing the little things right. And people ask me all the time, okay, get specific about it. And I'm like, well, it's kind of hard to get specific about it. It's sort of, treat others the way you'd want to be treated. But, I try to give people a couple of takeaways oftentimes when I speak, and that is that when you wake up in the morning, number one, think of somebody that you can express gratitude to and shoot them an email, give them a call, because it's not just you, it's them. And think of someone who you can give a word of encouragement to. how many times do we get up and we think about all the things we've got going on, but we don't think about the people around us, right?
Absolutely.
And think about who we can be influential to that day. And so granularly begin to think every day that way. And all of a sudden, you're going to find that you make a tremendous difference in people's lives. And these days, you can do it electronically. You don't have to even call them. Just shoot them an email. How are we doing today? How are you doing? I care about you. Or, what happened with your mother that you were talking to me about last week, whatever that is, but be personal about it. And I think when you do that, it goes a long way to people wanting to kill for you and ultimately wanting to work for you. Not that that's your only goal. It really isn't. I mean, you want to be authentic. You want to be genuine about it. You want to.
No, I know exactly. Really, I didn't take it that way. I know exactly what you mean, and I think it makes perfect sense. Is you really do. Again, that's a great result that you get by being personable, by caring, but it's not necessarily the only focus, right?
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so anyway, hopefully that resonates. And
absolutely. Gosh, absolutely.
It's a company. And by the way, today, Prologis, it was, I was around for, 4 years, 4.5, close to 5 years. We ultimately merged the company together with our next nearest competitor. And I was very fortunate enough because I wanted to retire again. And I did retire. The company today is really one of the rock stars of the real estate business. It really is. I mean, it's just amazing. I think they own over $150 billion in assets, one of the largest companies in the S&P 500. They're just a tremendous organization. And I'm very proud to have been there during the time when we built it and there during the time to help resurrect it. And looking back on it today, there's nothing to be more proud of.
God, well, you should be proud. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's one of the best performing, not just real estate companies, but I think it's one of the best performing on the S&P 500.
It has been over the last, call it 5 to 10 years. Yeah.
And so you took it from, hey, boss, I think we're going to bust some covenants, to one of the best performing. That's pretty amazing.
Well, I didn't take it all the way. The person who came after me, who was the CEO of the company that we merged with, has done a remarkable job as well. He's just done a tremendous job with the company. And I've got to give him all the credit for growing the company the way he has.
Well, that's awesome. That's great. That's very humble of you. So, all right. So Transfluence, right? So you can get it anywhere.
Yeah, you can get it on Amazon for sure. I hope you all read it and embrace it and learn something from it.
Absolutely. And look, it's this is no joke, but I just started it, and I try my hardest to be. I try to read a lot. I always have at least one, nonfiction book that's going to that I think is going to make me better going. And so it is. I just started it. It's on my list. And the next book won't get started till this one's done. What's one thing that you hope that somebody can take away after reading the book? Well,
okay, I want to talk. I would say this. I think good leadership is all about building trust, and I think there's a couple steps that I outline in the book that I think are very important. One, I think it's important to reflect on yourself, because I do think that the demons that kill good leaders are pride and fear. If you're prideful or you're very fearful in your leadership role, you got to deal with that. And I'd say one way that I dealt with it is I dealt with it through coaching. And I think the important thing is to learn as much about yourself as you can so that you can be there for other people and not be inwardly focused, but be outwardly focused. So that's the first. The second thing is I think you got to embrace transparency. I think communication these days in this marketplace, particularly, I think the world just demands a higher level of communication today, and you got to be communicating at all times and be transparent with your employees. The third thing I'd say is act authentically. I talk a lot in the book about what that means. I had a wonderful conversation with John Mack, who helped me think through that. And ultimately, I landed on what I call the 3 H's. I think the best leaders are humble. I think they're honest, and they're human. And so when I talk about acting authentically, I talk about leading with the 3 H's. That's in the book. And last but not least, I really think that employees need to have a sense of purpose about them. Meaning and purpose is very important. Didn't used to be when I started 40 years ago in the business or any business. Jobs were much more transactional back then. I went to work for a paycheck and that's what I got. Today, it's all about creating meaning and purpose in your job. And I think to the extent that you as a leader can bring that meaning and purpose to your employees such that they get up every morning and really want to come to work because they feel like they're accomplishing something, I think that's critically important as well. So the takeaway is, I think, those are 4 things to really think about. That's what Transfluence and that's what building trust is all about. And you as a manager ought to be thinking about how I build trust every day.
Damn. That's it. You nailed it. Well, that's very impressive. Very, very impressive. So everybody go out there and buy that book. It's going to be a mainstay on my bookshelf. And I'm also going to have my team read it as well.
Thank you, Brandon.
So
thanks.
Thank you. Well, final question, I promise, and then I'm gonna let you go. Thank you for all this time. If you had the opportunity to go back in time and talk to the Walt that just graduated from Harvard Business School,
yeah,
and was just sort of getting into the market, hungry and young and wide-eyed, what do you think that you would tell him?
You know what? I would tell him, obviously, hard work. Nothing replaces hard work in life. But I would say that, and this is before you're in a leadership role, right? Much of what I've been talking about today is leadership, but all of us always lead. We might be not necessarily leading a flock of people at work, but we're leading those around us. I would say attitude matters. I was on a conference call during the pandemic with Ed Bastian, who's the CEO of Delta Airlines.
Delta, yeah.
And their stock was down something like 90%. And by the way, their revenues were down over 90% because nobody was flying, right? And somebody asked Ed, they said, Ed, how are you dealing with this? And he said, let me tell you something. Leadership, me being the CEO of this company is a privilege and an honor. Even in this difficult time, it's a privilege and an honor. And my takeaway is, how can I change the lives of other people in all the things that are happening, right? And I think about that. I thought, geez, what a worse time to be a CEO than that moment. And yet, look at his attitude. It was amazing to me that the guy had an attitude, and also he had an attitude of gratitude. He was gracious for what he had been given in life. Ed is a man of faith, a deep believer, and he said, I'm gracious for all the things that have ever happened to me in my life, and I'm going to utilize that to try to make this situation better. And the man just had an attitude of gratitude. You hang up the phone, you're like, let's go get him.
Yeah.
I'm 95%. Come on, let's go.
How do I how do I help?
How do I help? And so you're coming out of college, have an attitude of gratitude, and realize that you've been given a lot, and now it's your opportunity to give back. And add that to all the other things I said, and I think you're going to be a hell of a leader.
Oh, I love that. By the way, I heard recently that the part of our brain that we use when we are expressing gratitude, when we feel gracious and we understand our blessings, is the exact same part of our brain that can produce anxiety and depression, and that it is almost impossible to express and feel gratitude while also simultaneously feeling anxiety and depression. And that in and of itself, for me, was inspiring to try to be more thoughtful about expressing and feeling gracious for all of my blessings. And so I just thought that was really cool.
I totally agree with you, Brandon. And, I think I was telling you in the beginning before we got on that I actually have my own podcast. It's called Off the Rack.
Yeah.
And in that, we're in our third season now. And every time that I have a guest on, I ask them the last question. And that is, what are you most thankful for? I hear that from somebody. What are you most thankful for? And I've had some interesting responses to that. But that to me it shows me a lot about an individual.
Yeah, that's really great. That's great. Well, Walt, I can't thank you enough for, your time is in high demand. And so I'm humbled that you would spend a little bit of it with me and with us, with the audience. So thank you very much. A lot of pearls of wisdom today that I think will go a long way. So I hope you have a great rest of the week, and we will certainly be in touch.
Thank you, Brandon.
Thanks, Walt. Don't forget, everybody, you can find Boundary Breakers in a lot of places. You can watch our episodes on the Boundary Breakers YouTube channel, or you can listen to each podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of the other major podcasting platforms. Thanks for listening.